Hi listeners, welcome to my audiobooks channel, The Classic Audiobooks, First Indians and Populations that are closely related to present-day West Eurasians. But these studies could not conclusively answer questions involving the direction of migration. What the latest ancient DNA-based study has done is exactly that, given a definitive answer to the question of the direction of migration, while also providing a finer understanding of the multiple migrations that caused the affinity between present-day Indians and West Eurasians. We now know that there was a migration of Iranian agriculturists from the Zagros region to the Indus Valley. From the SWOT samples, we also know there was a migration from the steppe, which we will talk about in detail later. When could the mixing between Iranian agriculturists and First Indians have taken place? By looking at the genetic data of the three outlier individuals from the BMAC and Shah Isokta, geneticists can determine the latest period by which the mixing could have happened. And that works out to between 4700 BCE and 3000 BCE. Genetics hasn't been able to work out a similar period for the earliest period by which mixing could have happened. But as we have seen, there is evidence for the beginnings of agriculture at Mehrgarh much earlier, from around 7000 BCE. So agriculture in Mehrgarh or elsewhere in the region could either have been begun locally by the first Indians with migrating agriculturists from the Zagros region arriving only later, or Iranian agriculturists may have moved into the region and brought with them some agricultural practices before mixing later with the first Indians, some of whom, we know, were experimenting with agriculture in places such as Lahoredeva. Of course, it could also mean that the Iranian agriculturists from Zagros arrived around 7000 BCE and mixed with first Indians around that time itself, since genetics hasn't provided the earliest date of the mixing. There is no reason to assume that agriculture only began in one place and then spread everywhere else. It is more likely that agriculture had multiple origins, around the same time, with different degrees of success in terms of productivity and, hence, population expansion. In all of these possible scenarios, it is clear that at some point in the trajectory of agriculture in the northwestern region of South Asia, whether right at the beginning or later, there was a significant influx of Iranian agriculturists from the Zagros region whose genetic imprint on the Indian population today is writ large. But hold on, before we conclude this chapter, just one more bit of evidence to complete the loop. Remember we had said that earlier uniparental chromosome studies had thrown up J2, L1 and L1C as the Y chromosome lineages that are likely to have come from West Asia to India. So what does the ancient DNA evidence have to say about this? What haplogroups did the ancient outlier individuals from Gonur and Shah Isokta belong to? Only two of them were male, and we know what their Y chromosome haplogroup is. It is J2, just as the uniparental DNA study had suggested. Looking back, one can say that after the initial arrival of modern humans in the subcontinent around 65,000 years ago, and after the invention of microliths that probably led to their unquestioned supremacy in the region and their growth in population, the startup at Mehrgarh was the most consequential development, a definitive turning point in the prehistory of India. The residents of Mehrgarh who raised the first mud brick homes of 2 or 3 rooms may not have realized it then, but they were laying the foundation for the first efflorescence of civilization in South Asia, called the Harappan civilization or the Indus Valley civilization. It took about 4,500 years, or over 150 generations, for those humble mud brick abodes to turn into the urban structures of a Harappa or a Mohenjo-daro or a Dholavira, and there must have been many twists and turns along the way. But once agriculture took root, and modern humans started creating a surplus that they could save and invest, the wheels of history started spinning fast, which would, of course, lead to the invention of the wheel itself. But what kind of a civilization did it lead to, and how? To that we turn in the next chapter. Postscript. When the Harappan civilization fell apart after 1900 BCE, the people who built it and kept it going for centuries spread out to the rest of the subcontinent to the east and the south, in particular. To use the imagery with which we began this chapter, the people of the Harappan civilization, a mix of the descendants of the first Indians and the Iranian agriculturist migrants, therefore became the sauce that was spread all over the crust of the pizza that is the Indian population. We will discuss this further in the epilogue. 3. The first urbanites, the Harappans, how the largest civilization of its time, with a unique set of practices and outlook, took wing, and how its creators spread the Dravidian languages and became the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians. It took nearly 5,000 years for the seeds that were planted, literally, in the Kutchi plain of Balochistan around 7000 BCE to grow into the mighty tree that was the Harappan civilization between 2600 and 1900 BCE. Not all agricultural societies become civilizations, but no civilization can become one without passing through the stage of agriculture. We'll come to precisely what a civilization is on p. 117. For the moment, let's take the term at face value. This is because at some stage in the development of agriculture, as productivity improves, not all people would need to be engaged in producing or procuring food. A significant number of people could be freed up to pursue other activities such as building walls or monuments for new cities, making new tools, weapons and jewelry, organizing long-distance trade, creating new artistic masterpieces, coming up with new inventions, keeping accounts, and perhaps constructing new public infrastructure such as irrigation canals that further improve the productivity of agriculture, thus releasing even more people to do new things. This can happen, of course, only if a society that has transitioned to high productivity agriculture has also, at some stage in its evolution, found a way to channel the bonanza of free time into other work fruitfully. In the ancient world, this often involved creating new ideologies and new hierarchies or power structures to coerce or otherwise convince large groups of people to devote their time to the new tasks for very little reward. Religion often came in handy in this process and so, sometimes, did violence. Since the script used by the Harappans has not yet been deciphered, despite nearly a century of concentrated effort by experts from around the world, we do not have enough direct, written evidence about the new ideology and power relationships that accompanied the emergence of the urban civilization of Harappa. But we get glimpses of their ideology and clues about the power structure from the seal motifs, designs, architecture and sculptures they left behind. Almost every step of the physical, material processes that led from the two-room brick houses and barley fields of Mehrgarh to the monumental structures of cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro and Oliveira has been well documented archaeologically, with no major breaks or gaps in between. We can see, on the ground, farming villages spreading from the Kutchi plain to other parts of Balochistan, the Indus Valley, the Ghaggar-Hakra Valley, Gujarat and beyond. Over thousands of years, they slowly grew into different regional cultures with walled towns and different styles of pottery. Then around 2600 BCE, these individual cities coalesced into what would come to be called the Harappan civilization, spread across a vast region lying mostly along the valleys of two major river systems, the Indus, which still continues to flow, and the Ghaggar-Hakra, which has mostly gone dry since. At its peak, the civilization covered much of Pakistan, northeastern Afghanistan and western India, including mainly the states of Punjab, Rajasthan, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh and Gujarat. This continuity shows that the people who built one of the earliest, largest and most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world did not suddenly appear from elsewhere. They were here for long and they built it from scratch. The earlier assumption that the Harappan civilization was an offshoot of the Mesopotamian civilization has, therefore, been proved wrong. The Mesopotamian civilization lasted from around 4000 BCE to arguably 330 BCE when the region was conquered by Alexander, and it spanned Iraq, Kuwait, northern Saudi Arabia, southeastern Turkey, eastern Syria and parts of Iran. There are no mysteries about the development of the Harappan civilization that would be solved by the assumed migration of later-day city builders from Mesopotamia. Of course, as we saw in Chapter 2, the people of the Harappan civilization were themselves a mixture of agriculturists from the Zagros mountains of Iran and the descendants of the first Indians. But that admixture happened millennia before the first cities of the Harappan civilization went up, and, therefore, it would make no sense to describe the population as anything but South Asian, just as it would make no sense to treat Asian, European and American civilizations as African, since all modern humans originally came from there. This is not to say that there were no contacts between the Mesopotamian civilization and the Harappan civilization. The significant trade relations between the two have left behind many archaeological footprints, and there are symbolic or cultural artifacts which clearly show influences that run both ways. For example, there are Mesopotamian seals that show the water buffalo, a natural resident of the Indus Valley and North Mesopotamia. In one Mesopotamian seal, a hero grapples with a buffalo, while in another, nude. Heroes slake the thirst of water buffaloes. Both seals belong to the period of the Akkadian Emperor Sargon. Asko Parpola, author and emeritus professor of South Asian Studies at the University of Helsinki, explains it this way: it has been plausibly suggested that Harappans brought some water buffaloes from the Indus Valley by ship, given that Sargon boasts that ships came from far-off Mellaha to his new capital, Akkad. Mellaha was the name by which the Harappan civilization was known to the West Asians, and there are many references to it in Mesopotamian records, including an inscription on a cylinder seal that reads, Su Ilisu, interpreter of the Mellahan language. There is also evidence of elephants, rhinoceroses and peacocks reaching Mesopotamia from Mellaha. And it was not just animals and birds. Mario Liverani, professor of ancient Near East history at the Sapienza University of Rome, says sesame, a plant of South Asian origin, came to Mesopotamia via the Indus Valley and was acclimatized to the new environment as a summer crop. Seasonally it did well with cereal cultivation, which took place in the winter, writes Liverani in Arak, 7 he first city. On the other hand, there are 5 seals from Mohenjo-Daro and 6 molded tablets from Harappa depicting a hero holding off 2 tigers on his right and left with bare hands, and these are strikingly similar to the seals of Mesopotamia and the mythology around the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. In the Mesopotamian seals, the king is usually holding off lions instead of tigers in the same manner, but there are no depictions of lions in the Harappan civilization. It is, of course, possible, as the archaeologist and author Jonathan Mark Kenoyer argues, that the tale of a hero dealing with ferocious animals in this manner is a myth that predates both civilizations and goes back to the hunter-gatherer period, and that both the Mesopotamians and the Harappans were interpreting this in their own manner in their artifacts. The way in which some men in both Harappan and Mesopotamian sculptures wear their upper cloth is also strikingly similar, with the robe being drawn over their left shoulder and under the right arm, leaving the right shoulder bare. The distinctive trefoil design, a 3-leaf clover, on the robe worn by the priest king, one of the most magnificent sculptures recovered from Mohenjo-Daro, is found in Mesopotamia as well. Says Asko Parpola in 7 he Roots of Hinduism, West Asian gods and divine kings had festive clothes with golden stars, rosettes and so forth sewn onto them, which were known in Sumerian and Akkadian as sky garments. The cloak of the priest king statue from Mohenjo-Daro is clearly a form of sky garment decorated with trefoils, originally filled with red paste. The hairstyle of some men on the Harappan sculptures, the plaited double bun or chignon, is also found in Mesopotamian sculptures, including one of Emperor Sargon himself in the city of Susa. The Dutch archaeologist Elizabeth C. L. During Caspers describes the hairstyle thus: the hair is dressed in a bun, which is then secured horizontally, by means of a ribbon or hair slide of some sort, resulting in the division of hair into 2 protuberances one above the other. But these possible proofs of cultural interaction and influence both ways do not change the fact that the Harappan civilization in its essence was unique and significantly different from the civilization to its west. A civilization like no other. Let us count the ways in which it is so. Unlike the Mesopotamians with their monumental ziggurats, houses for the patron gods and goddesses of each city, the Harappans have nothing that can be identified as grand temples or even large ritual places. 32 ziggurats have been discovered so far in Mesopotamia, 28 in Iraq and 4 in Iran, but not even a single structure has been clearly identified as a temple in the vast expanse of the Harappan civilization. Neither were there clearly recognizable palaces for the kings in Thay. Harappan civilization, again quite unlike in Mesopotamia. The Harappans also did not set up sculptures glorifying kings and their exploits, unlike in the civilization to its west. Even the well-known and skillfully carved priest-king sculpture of Mohenjo-Daro is no more than 17.5 centimeters in height and 11 centimeters in width. And there is no way to even tell whether it represents a king or a priest or a nobleman. Most archaeologists would only go as far as to say that the sculpture might represent a prominent member of the ruling elite of Mohenjo-Daro. What about elaborate funerals for the royals, a major feature of West Asia and Egypt? No, there are no signs of ostentatious and elaborate funerals for anyone in the Harappan civilization, and no pyramids for departed leaders either as in Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the royals were buried with enormous hoards of precious jewelry, artifacts and sometimes even their servants, all to meet their corporeal needs in the afterlife. In the Harappan civilization, by contrast, burials are often accompanied by pottery containing food for the afterlife and not much more, though people were often interred with their personal ornaments. There is nothing remotely suggestive of the kind of royal funerals that seem to have been common in West Asia. The historian Shireen Rutnagar says in Understanding Harappa that graves had an average of 15 pots, with some provision of food and drink for the departed, including joints of bottom of the internal latrines that the homes were provided with, suggesting that the way South Asians wash themselves hasn't changed all that much, even if many South Asians today do not have the indoor facilities that the Harappans enjoyed. And not just the residents. Kenoya says there were bathing platforms and public wells for the convenience of visitors and traders too in Harappa. No contemporary civilization, whether Egyptian, Mesopotamian or Chinese, had anything similar on offer when it came to public conveniences for residents or guests. Even more striking than the civic amenities, perhaps, is another feat of the Harappans: uniform weights. Across the length and breadth of this largest of civilizations there was only one way to weigh materials, using standardized cubic weights made of chert, a type of rock. The cities of Mesopotamia, by contrast, had a medley of weighing systems, differing both by region and by the commodity that was to be weighed. By avoiding unnecessary conversions between different weighing standards when traders moved from one city to another, the Harappans must have significantly reduced the transaction costs of business. If there were an ease of doing business ranking in the 3rd millennium BCE, the Harappans would have been front-runners, along with the Egyptians perhaps, who also had a similar, standardized weighing system. As ubiquitous as the weights in Harappan cities were the bangles, hundreds of thousands of them. If you think bangles are nothing unique, you would be wrong. As Kenoya says, if I call my friends in Egypt and ask them how many bangles did you excavate, they may say a dozen or one or two. In China, you may find one or two. In Mesopotamia, you may find a few. But in the Indus Valley, we find hundreds of thousands of bangles. They were distinctive ornaments and they were for both females and males. We can go on listing an endless variety of things that are unique to the Harappans and are still clearly recognizable as Indian by us in the 21st century, from seals that show veneration for the peepul tree to the handi, or the cooking pot, with a ridge on the top that deflects the fire so that the ridge doesn't get hot and you can pick it up, as Kenoya explains. The pottery styles differed across Harappan cities, but the handi design was so popular that these cooking pots could be found everywhere. Perhaps the most important distinction of the Harappan civilization was its sheer size. At its height, it may have covered almost 1 million square kilometers, more than the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations combined. The Harappan civilization is also likely to have had the largest population of any contemporary civilization, which is not surprising, considering that we were the largest modern human population even as far back as 20,000 years ago, as we saw in Chapter 1. South Asia being the center of modern human population is not a new phenomenon, it is just an ancient track record that we continue to maintain. To get a sense of how big an area the civilization occupied, remember that today's India covers about 3 million square kilometers. The Harappan civilization covered about a third of that. Imagine what it would have taken to knit together such a large civilization through common standards of weights, seals, script, city design and even burnt bricks which had a uniform height to width to length ratio of 1:4. And all this without modern methods of communication and travel. Despite the geographical range of the civilization, it seems to have been less conflict-prone than its Western counterparts. Was it also less unequal than its Western counterparts? The answer to that is not clear. The lack of palaces and ostentatious burials could suggest a less unequal society, but the unequal sizes of residences in the cities and the importance of status goods such as precious jewelry suggest otherwise. Most historians today believe that the Harappan civilization was held together by an elite group rather than one powerful king controlling the different city-states. So whichever way you look, the Harappan civilization seems to have sprung from very different impulses and instincts than other contemporary civilizations, and the Harappans seem to have made different choices about the kind of society they wanted to live in. But how did a collection of farming villages evolve into something that can be called a civilization? And what exactly do we mean by civilization anyway? Why do we often proclaim that the Indian civilization is about 5,000 years old and not, say, 9,000 years old when agriculture began, or, say, about 2,300 years old when the Mauryas built the first Indian empire? The word civilization is etymologically connected to city, so one could say civilization presupposes an urban transition or an urban revolution, as Gordon Childe, the prehistorian admiringly called the great synthesizer, described it in the 1930s. According to Childe, the earliest cities of the world exhibited the following characteristics: a population that is often hundreds of times larger than any village, full-time specialists such as craftsmen, merchants, officials and transport workers, a ruling class that accumulates the surplus production of the peasants, monumental public buildings, systems of recording and writing without which it would be impossible to manage a city, full-time artists, sculptors, painters, seal engravers who created things in a style that is unique and specific to a particular civilization, and foreign trade to get materials not available locally. Each of these attributes applies to all the major Harappan sites, from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro to Dholavira, Rakhigadi and Kalaibingan. The first city in the world by this definition would be Arak in Lower Mesopotamia, perhaps better known as the capital city of Gilgamesh, the mythic hero of 7th epic of Gilgamesh. At the height of its power, around 3200 BCE, Arak would have had tens of thousands of people within its walls, much like Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro around 2600 BCE. So when we say the Indian civilization is 5,000 years old, what we mean is that the first cities of the Harappan civilization were going up around then. This is broadly correct, though what is usually called the mature Harappan phase of the civilization began only around 2600 BCE, that is, about 4,600 years ago. It is around this time that the usage of a common script and common seals became prevalent across the cities of the civilization, but many elements that go into the making of a civilization were already in process by then. For example, we see the first markings on post-fired pottery that would later develop into a script as early as 3300 BCE in Harappa, around the same time when early writing begins in Mesopotamia, Egypt and China. We also see the first massive walls being built around two separate areas adjacent to each other in Harappa around 2800 BCE. It would have taken 450 men around 3 months to build these walls, and these could not have been constructed without the ability to make and transport bricks on a very large scale. There is indeed evidence to suggest that by this time ox carts and bullock carts were in extensive use. There are terracotta toy cart fragments from Harappa and cartwheels from Girawad in Haryana dated to around 3700 BCE. This is around the same time that wheeled carts start making an appearance in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. If you want to get a sense of the grandeur that was the Harappan civilization, the one place in India where you need to go is Dholavira in the Great Run of Kutch in Gujarat, a 7-hour drive from Ahmedabad or a distance of about 350 kilometers. It is situated on the island of Khadir, surrounded by salt plains, and you have to drive through the stunning landscape of the White Run to reach there. The long, straight, almost empty road cuts through the flat land, with the sunlight reflecting off the unending terrain of white salt on both sides. You begin to wonder, why did anyone bother to build a city in such a remote place, before you remember the answer. Water today. Salt marshes were about 4 meters underwater when the city was thriving, thus making the city a crucial hub for the Harappan civilization's substantial overseas trade with Mesopotamia. Once you reach Dholavira, you feel you have fallen down a wormhole and have emerged on the other side of space-time. It is the grandest Harappan site on Indian soil, and your heart beats faster as you walk around the ruins and see what your ancestors were up to some 4,500 years ago. Yes, it is right to call them our ancestors, and we will come to that later in this chapter. More than anything else, it is the scale of the ruins and the perfection and robustness of the walls and foundations that are still standing that strikes one. The ruins are spread over nearly 100 hectares, with the fortified city divided into a citadel on a raised platform, a middle town, and a lower town, occupying about half of it. The citadel, with its own additional fortification, is further divided into a castle, which may have been where the ruling elite lived, and a bailey, which seems to have been the quarters for important officials. Of course, these names were given by archaeologists, and we do not know what the residents called them, and we are not even fully sure that the buildings were put to the kind of use that we think they were. For example, there is a large stadium that separates the citadel from the middle town and which stands for seating spectators. It is reasonable to think that this might have been used for public ceremonies or spectacles of some kind. Of course, it could have been used as a market on some days too. There are also several large reservoirs, 3 of which have been excavated. Dholavira, like other Harappan sites in Gujarat but unlike sites elsewhere, made extensive use of sandstone in its architecture along with mud brick. Most Harappan cities, by contrast, are built with sun-baked or fire-burnt bricks. It is clear that the city was built to a plan, like many other Harappan sites, and did not haphazardly evolve over time. The archaeologist R.S. Bisht, who headed the Dholavira excavation, describes the city thus: excellent town planning with mathematical precision. The entire site was mapped out and divided into squares and triangles, and there was a definite ratio and proportion to each minor or major division. The people who conceived of the city and built it seem to have thought and acted on such a scale that after Dholavira went into decline around 1900 BCE, like the rest of the Harappan cities, we had to wait for another millennium and a half or so, until the Mauryas came along, to see architecture of such scale and ambition again. From farmers to city dwellers, historians divide the period from the beginnings of agriculture in places such as Mergad 7000 BCE to the disintegration of the Harappan civilization 5 millennia later into 4 broad stages: the early food-producing era 7500 BCA, regionalization early Harappan era 5500-600 BCA, integration or mature Harappan era 2600-1900 BCE, and localization or late Harappan era 1900-1300 BCA. The first stage, the early food-producing era, is easy enough to track. The Mergad settlement lasted from around 7000 BCE to around 2600 BCE, but during this period we can see numerous other settlements springing up. The population was exploding as agriculture spread, which has happened in every part of the world that took to cultivating cereals. Some examples of new agricultural settlements are Kili Gul Muhammad in the Quetta Valley, which could have begun around 5000 BCE. Dam Sadat in Balochistan, which may go back to 3500 BCE. And Mundigak in southeastern Afghanistan, which dates back to 4000-3500 BCE. Apart from Balochistan and nearby areas, the agricultural revolution was taking place in Amri in the Indus Plains in Sindh, which goes back to 3600 BCE. Rahman Deri in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which dates back to 3300 BCE, Kunal and Rakhigadi in Haryana, which go back to anywhere from 4500 BCE to 3600 BCE, and Bhirana in Haryana's Fatehabad district, which goes back even further. Many more such sites today stand as evidence that from around 7000 BCE onward the practice of agriculture was spreading rapidly in northwestern India, followed by urbanization. It would be wrong to think, though, that the population of this rapidly transforming region was formed entirely of settled farmers and city dwellers. The farmers themselves were dependent on some level of hunting and gathering still, but, more importantly, there is clear evidence of nomadic herders living in the same areas. Ratnagar says, Mergad lies on the frontier between Sindh and Balochistan. The lower Indus plain is primarily agricultural, but over much of the broken mountain terrain of Balochistan, it is animal herding that has prevailed over farming, which latter is confined to the narrow valleys of Balochistan. The Kutchi plain is a permeable frontier, in the sense that pastoralists from the mountains around Kalad, Quetta and Lorelai, who need to move their sheep from the snow-bound mountain slopes, descend on the Kutchi plain in November with their tents and animals, and sojourn amongst the local sedentary agriculturists until about February. They return to the mountains in the warmer weather. Even now there are many, like the Brahuis of Balochistan, who continue the pastoral tradition. Many historians believe that pastoralists were crucial participants in the emerging farming economies, both by playing a role in the exchange networks and by conveying plants and animals, new information and new inventions from one place to another, and sometimes even settling down in new areas to become farmers themselves. For many hunter-gatherers in regions far away from the two main river valleys, these nomadic herders would probably have been their first contact with a different way of living. The next stage, the regionalization or early Harappan era, is also easily graspable from the archaeological records. This is when, as the burgeoning population kept expanding into new areas, regional differences in style and culture began to become evident. Some of the bigger settlements of this period, such as Kalaibingan, Banwali and Rahman Deri, were fortified. The cultural differences were most visible in the pottery styles bearing names such as Hakra, Ravi, Balakot, Amri, Kot Diji, Nal and Sothi. An amateur may perhaps not notice the differences between these pottery types, but an archaeologist will be able to pick them out and classify them even from a jumbled pile. The most fascinating stage to inquire into, however, is the transition to the integration period or the mature Harappan era. This is when we see many Harappan sites being newly built or rebuilt and many existing sites being abandoned, thus indicating a major realignment of population and settlements. This is also when we see a higher level of standardization, with a common script, seals, motifs and weights, spreading across the region. Overseas trade with West Asia gained significant momentum during this period as well. In the mature Harappan period, local or regional culture traditions lost their distinctiveness as the metropolitan material culture engulfed the regions, writes Ratnagar in Understanding Harappa. In A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India, Upinder Singh points out that many mature Harappan sites had no early Harappan level, while many early Harappan sites had no mature Harappan levels. And some of the sites that had both early Harappan and mature Harappan levels had some suggestion of an upheaval during the transition. Kot Diji, Gumla, Amri and Noshiro, for instance, had evidence of a major fire or burning between the two levels. In short, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the transition to the mature Harappan era, which archaeologists say happened over a period of 4 or 5 generations of 100 to 150 years, could not have happened without a central authority of some kind making decisions that were applied and accepted across the region, by persuasion or otherwise. The Arak example, we have a pretty clear idea of what happened during a similar transition at Arak in Lower Mesopotamia because of the extensive excavations over decades that have thrown up written records relating to administrative and legal matters. In Arak, 7 he first city Livarani dissects the process in detail. According to him, it was the need for coordinated group action to create irrigation in southern Lower Mesopotamia that ultimately led to urbanization. The irrigation system was needed because of the specific geography of southern Lower Mesopotamia, as opposed to northern Lower Mesopotamia. The northern region was a valley with narrow fields on both sides of the river, while the southern region was a delta, with broad fields on either side of the river. Irrigation in the valley did not require anything more than occasional submersion of the fields from the overflow of the river, something that could be managed by a single family. In the delta, on the other hand, there was a huge opportunity to increase production by creating irrigation canals that took the water from the river to deeper inside, which required coordinated action by groups of people. Rivarani says, the long L's therefore required the presence of a central coordinating agency for their planning and management. Once installed, they allowed productivity on a large scale, and they were connected to other innovations. These innovations include the seeder plow pulled by 2 or more pairs of oxen that plowed the field and also sowed the seeds, and the threshing sledge pulled by an ass. Rivarani estimates that canal irrigation combined with the use of animal traction would have increased the production of barley, the main crop, by 5 to 10 times, assuming no change in the number of people employed. During this period of unprecedented plenty, austerity and equality in society, as depicted by the house sizes and burial practices, remained unchanged. But something else did change: the size of the temples. To quote Rivarani, the moment of deity that appears at several Harappan sites around the beginning of the mature Harappan period, with what looks like a buffalo horn headdress. Since horn figures are divinities in the Mesopotamian civilization, some believe that this could be a shared motif. A few seals have a horn figure sitting in a striking yoga-like pose on a stool of some kind, indicating that if this was not a divinity, it must at least have been a very important figure in the civilization. Another seal shows a person sitting in a tree, perhaps talking to a tiger that is turning its head to look at him. One seal shows a hero placing his foot on the horns of a water buffalo while spearing it in front of an erect cobra. It is clear that seals depict scenes that are evocative of religious beliefs or myths or stories that were well known to the Harappans. What these were is, of course, beyond our ken today, though we can clearly see that some concepts did pass on to later periods, from the sacredness of the peepul tree to the yoga-like pose. The language of the Harappans. One question is key to tracing the formation of Indian populations: what language did the Harappans speak? Most historians argue that many languages would have been spoken in the vast region of the civilization, not just one. Considering how many languages are spoken in the region today, from Baluchi, Pashto, Punjabi and Gujarati to Hindi, Rahui, Sindhi and Burushaski, this is not an unreasonable surmise. However, it is still possible that the civilization had one predominant language family with its own dialects or subgroups. It is also likely that it had an official language that was depicted in the seals. How do we know that? When a script is used for writing different languages, the order in which the signs, letters appear usually changes in a noticeable manner. For example, in the Harappan seals that were found in Mesopotamia or the Gulf region, experts have found that the pattern or order in which the signs appear is different from the way they appear on seals found in the Harappan civilization itself, suggesting that in the seals found abroad the Harappan script may have been used to write a different language, perhaps Akkadian or Sumerian or other languages spoken in the Gulf region. There are no such differences in sign patterns among seals found in the Harappan civilization region itself. Therefore, it is likely that at least during the mature Harappan period, when there was a high degree of standardization in general, there was one language that was predominantly used, perhaps for administrative, trade and legal purposes. So what language could this be? This would be an easy question to answer once the Harappan script is deciphered. But a century of sustained and determined efforts by a wide variety of experts from all over the world have failed to crack the script. This is not necessarily surprising, because the hieroglyphic script of Egypt may not have been deciphered at all had people not stumbled upon an inscription that used multiple scripts to say the same thing. In 1799, French soldiers rebuilding a fort in Egypt discovered a stone with carvings on it in a town called Rosetta in the Nile Valley. This came to be called the Rosetta Stone, and it was found to have been carved in 196 BCE by a group of priests in Egypt to honor the then pharaoh, by listing all the things he had done for the people. Propaganda, obviously, has very ancient beginnings. Remarkably, the Rosetta Stone had inscriptions in 3 scripts, all of them in use in Egypt when the stone was carved. The first was hieroglyphic, which was used for important religious documents. The second was Demotic, which was then the common script of Egypt. And the third was Greek, the language of the rulers of Egypt at that time. Shortly thereafter, the hieroglyphic script was deciphered by the French scholar and philologist Jean-François Champollion, who could read Greek and Coptic, a language that shares much with Demotic. Thus a script that had resisted all attempts at decipherment for centuries was finally decoded within a couple of decades of the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The story is similar in the case of the cuneiform script, in which many Mesopotamian languages were written, including Sumerian, Akkadian and Elamite. Here too, it was the discovery of a multilingual inscription at Mount Bahastan in the Kermanshah province of Iran that led to the final decipherment. The Bahastan inscription was authored by Darius I, the fourth king of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, sometime between 522 BCE and 486 BCE, and is an account of the king's life, battles and victories. The inscription had the same text in 3 different languages written using the same cuneiform script: Old Persian, Elamite and Akkadian. For the Harappan language, however, we have not yet found an equivalent of the Rosetta Stone or the Bahastan inscription, and until we do, cracking the code might prove to be difficult. Historians and archaeologists have so far overwhelmingly backed the idea that the language underlying the Harappan script was Proto-Dravidian, but the inability to break the code has left the question hanging, without a final resolution. The debate over what language the Harappans spoke has resembled a Gordian knot more than anything else until now. The Gordian knot is now being cut, not because the script is closer to being deciphered, but because ancient DNA findings have now joined hands with archaeology and linguistics to provide a consistent and coherent explanation for the demographic composition and the language of the Harappans. The crucial thing to keep in mind is that these 3 disciplines are independent of each other, with different starting points. They also use very different materials, methodologies and scientific techniques to arrive at their conclusions. Thus it is remarkable that they all arrive at the same conclusion. Genetic and archaeological evidence. We saw in Chapter 2 how new ancient DNA evidence from West Asian and the Indus periphery individuals showed that an Iranian agriculturist population from around the Zagros region had contributed significantly to the populations in India today. This discovery rested on 2 sets of ancient DNA evidence. Let's recount them briefly. The first set of ancient DNA evidence was from the Zagros region of Iran, dated to between 8000 BCE and 7000 BCE. It showed that these Zagrosians had a distinct type of West Eurasian ancestry. What differentiated them from others of the region was that they lacked the early Anatolian ancestry that the rest of them had. The second set of evidence was ancient DNA from 3 Indus periphery outlier individuals with a unique genetic composition. Between 14 and 42% of their ancestry related to first Indians, and the rest to Iranian agriculturists, and none of them had any Anatolian ancestry. This was quite unlike others around them in the same region, who all had Anatolian ancestry and no ancestry related to the first Indians. The genomic formation of South and Central Asia study, therefore, arrived at the inescapable conclusion that these 3 ancient individuals were recent migrants from the Harappan civilization. That they represent the genetic composition of the population of the Harappan civilization itself, and that they are a mixture of Iranian agriculturists from the Zagros region and descendants of the first Indians. The scientists also concluded that the admixture between the 2 populations had taken place at the latest between 4700 BCE and 3000 BCE. Please note that at no stage of this genetic trail was any reliance made on archaeological or linguistic discoveries. No less emphatic than the genetic evidence as the archaeological evidence. In Chapter 2, we saw extensive confirmation of a connection between the Zagros region and the early farmers of Mergad in Balochistan. From quadrangular houses built with narrow bricks about 60 centimeters long to circular fire pits filled with burnt pebbles and sequential slab construction of pottery, the similarities were striking. To quote Jarrett, in spite of some obvious differences, The full setting of the farming economy at Mehrgarh displays evident similarities with what had been noticed in the case of the early Neolithic settlements in the hilly regions forming the eastern border of Mesopotamia, that is, the Zagros Mountains of Iran. The similarities noticed between Neolithic sites from the eastern border of Mesopotamia to the western margins of the Indus Valley are significant. A sort of cultural continuum between sites sharing a rather similar geographical context marked with an also rather similar pattern of evolution and transformation becomes more and more evident. In other words, archaeological evidence comes to the same conclusion as ancient DNA evidence. There is a strong connection between the Zagrosians and the people of the Harappan civilization region, dating back to a period when agriculture was only beginning in Mehrgarh. This now brings us to the third and equally important evidence linking the two regions: language. Proto-Zagrosian and Proto-Dravidian. What languages did the West Asians speak? We can confidently answer this question only from the time when languages were written down, beginning sometime after 3500 BCE. Many Mesopotamian languages were written in the cuneiform script, until it fell into disuse in the early centuries of the Common Era. The languages that were written down using cuneiform include isolates such as Sumerian, Elamite, Hattic, Hurrian and Urartian, Semitic languages such as Akkadian, Eblite and Amorite, and the Indo-European languages Hittite and Luwian. All these languages became extinct long ago and are not spoken anywhere today. Note that the phrase Mesopotamian civilization covers multiple kingdoms, city-states and empire over thousands of years, not just one kingdom or empire. The ancient DNA study said that the Zagrosian population and the subcontinent's first Indians had to have mixed at least by between 4700 BCE and 3000 BCE. The study did not mention the earliest possible date for the admixture. But we know that the Mehrgarh settlement, with its close connections to people from the eastern border of Mesopotamia, began around 7000 BCE. So if we are to arrive at a period of the migration, or the arrival of the Zagrosian people in South Asia, it would be sometime between 7000 BCE and 3000 BCE. So which of the Mesopotamian languages listed above are they likely to have brought to South Asia? A serious candidate for this would be Elamite, the language of a people who built one of the most powerful and intermittently persistent kingdoms in the area covering central and southern Zagros Mountains, as also the plains of Khuzestan and the Persian Gulf Coast in today's Iran. The first Elamite kingdom came into being sometime around 2700 BCE, but as we have seen, the migrations from Zagros to South Asia happened much earlier. The migrants, therefore, could not have been products of the urban civilization of Elam, they preceded it. They may have spoken a Proto-Elamite language. Depending on the period of their migration, it is also possible that they were not full-fledged agriculturists yet, but herders who may, nonetheless, have had some exposure to the newly emerging culture of farming. As we saw in Chapter 2, the earliest evidence for domestication of goats comes from Ganj Dere in the central Zagros Mountains of Mesopotamia, from around 7900 BCE, the same archaeological site from where the ancient DNA was collected for the genetic study. We also saw that Mesopotamians had started migrating with their animals or goats even before the full agricultural package. Cultivation of barley and wheat along with some lentils and raising sheep, goats and cattle had become common in the region. Therefore, it is quite possible that the group of Proto-Elamite speaking people from the south or central Zagros region who migrated to Balochistan and the surrounding areas such as Mehrgarh may have been herders with some exposure to the newly emerging practice of farming. Some of these Zagrosian migrants who reached South Asia may have remained herders to this day, like the Brahuis of Balochistan. They speak the Brahui language, which has been linguistically determined to be closely connected to Elamite. Other migrants from the Zagros may have settled down in places like Mehrgarh to become farmers, and both the herders and the farmers may have mixed with the existing population, the first Indians, at some point. The first Indians themselves had started experimenting with agriculture in places like Lahorideva in the middle Ganga plain by then, as we saw earlier, and they may have been doing so in Balochistan as well. So the best guess we can make based on archaeological and genetic Evidence is that a population of herders from the southern or central Zagros region, speakers of Proto-Elamite or related language, migrated to South Asia sometime after 7000 BCE, mixed with the first Indians, and this new, mixed population sparked an agricultural revolution in the northwestern region of India and then went on to create the Harappan civilization over the next few millennia. If this reconstruction of history based on archaeology and genetics is correct, then Proto-Elamite must have left a significant mark on the linguistic history of the subcontinent. Could it be Brahui with its proven links to Elamite? To some extent, yes. But considering the geographical size and demographic weight of the Harappan civilization, there should be a much larger footprint. Could there be one? Yes, there could be. Dravidian languages, spoken by nearly a fifth of the population of India. Somewhere between 250 million and 300 million people speak a Dravidian language in the world today, making it one of the top 6 language families. So to this we turn now, linguistic research that shows the close connection between the Dravidian languages of India and Elamite. A paper published in 2013 titled, South Asia, Dravidian Linguistic History, authored by 2 linguists who have specialized in Dravidian languages, Professor Franklin C. Southworth and Dr. David W. McAlpin, is a good place to start. McAlpin had earlier reconstructed the vocabulary of Proto-Dravidian PD, the ancient language from which all Dravidian languages, not just Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada and Telugu, but also languages such as Gondi and several others descend, and the 2013 study uses this early vocabulary to make deductions about where and when the language may have been spoken. This is how the paper's section on PD begins. The reconstructed vocabulary of PD reflects a society engaged in animal husbandry, with some knowledge of agriculture. Words for sheep, goat and cattle, all inherited from Proto-Zagrosian, the parent language of Proto-Elamite, along with verbs referring to driving and grazing animals, words for herd, flock, shepherd, and several words which mean both house-dwelling and animal stall indicate the importance of herding. No specific words for cranes are reconstructible, although reconstructed agricultural terms include words for digging and digging tools, operations such as winnowing, churning, reaping, and grinding grain, along with several words meaning grain or seed, chaff, and husk, and possibly a word for the plow. The only reconstructible food plant names are onion, garlic, yam, and eggplant, some of which may be later borrowings into individual Dravidian languages: Elamo-Dravidian, toll, to perforate, bo, Middle Elamite, tullan, reach, cut, slice, Proto-Dravidian, toll, to perforate, bo, Telugu, toluku, to bo, perforate. 8. Proto-Elamo-Dravidian, cut to die, Middle Elamite, sa, his life should be cut off, Proto-Dravidian, cut to die, Tamil ca, we, say, to die, be blighted, Malayalam, kakuka, ca, to die. 9. Proto-Elamo-Dravidian, ul, inside, anterior, mind, heart, to think, Middle Elamite, ulhi, dwelling place, residence, sanctuary, Tamil, ul.l.am, mind, thought. 10. Proto-Elamo-Dravidian, cat, bed, throne, Royal Achaemenid Elamite, cat place, throne, Proto-Dravidian, cat.t.il, court, bedstead, throne of distinction, Tamil, cat.t.il, court, bedstead. Correspondences between the 2 languages in terms of word roots is only one part of McAlpin's work, the other an equally substantial part of his work looks at similarities in terms of morphology and other elements that go into the making of any language. There is yet another striking piece of evidence that suggests that the Harappan language was Proto-Dravidian, but which McAlpin doesn't mention because it deals not with Elamite, but with Akkadian, one of the dominant Semitic languages of the Mesopotamian civilization. In Chapter 2, page 103, we saw there was one plant that was imported from the Harappan civilization to Mesopotamia, sesame. Remarkably, the name of this oilseed is the same in Akkadian and in many Dravidian languages of South India today, Elu. Writes Professor Southworth in Linguistic Archaeology of South Asia, the sharing of a word for sesame between Mesopotamia, Akkadian Elu, and South India, South Dravidian 1, Elu, reinforces the hypothesis of the presence of Dravidian speakers in the prehistoric Indus Valley. What about Indo-European languages that today dominate the region? That once belonged to the Harappan civilization? could not these languages have been spoken there during the Harappan period? We will come to that in Chapter 4, but briefly, the generally accepted chronology for the spread of Indo-European languages around the world puts their arrival in South Asia only after 2000 BCE, when the Harappan civilization was already in decline. This has been strongly supported by recent genetic studies based on ancient DNA, which suggest that steppe pastoralists, who took Indo-European languages to Europe, reached India only in the late Harappan period, bringing with them an early version of Sanskrit and related cultural concepts and practices such as ritual sacrifices. Many of these practices and beliefs are reflected in the Vedas, especially the earliest one, the Rigveda. The newly arrived Indo-European language speakers called themselves Aryans. What all of this means is that the Harappan civilization had nothing to do with the Aryans, or Sanskrit or the Vedas, and was pre-Aryan or pre-Vedic. We will discuss this further in the next chapter. Deciphering the Harappan script. It is no surprise then that most of the attempts at deciphering the Harappan script have assumed that the language underlying it was Dravidian. Even though the script has not been deciphered after nearly a century of concerted attempts, the efforts of two independent experts in particular have been noteworthy: Dr. Iravatham Mahadevan, the epigraphist who helped decipher the Tamil Brahmi script in which the earliest records of Dravidian are kept, and Professor Asko Parpola. Each of them brought new perspectives on how to start reading the script. Until the script is deciphered, it cannot be used to either buttress or weaken the common conclusions being reached by archaeology, genetics and linguistics. However, it is worth quoting Mahadevan's convocation address at the Dravidian University in Kuppam, Andhra Pradesh, in 2015, for two reasons. 1. His strong rebuttal of the belief that the Harappans spoke an Indo-European language and that they were Vedic Aryans. And 2. His description of the direction in which the deciphering efforts are tending. The results I have obtained so far confirm that the language of the Indus script is an early form of Dravidian. I do not claim to have deciphered the Indus script completely. But I sincerely believe that I have discovered important clues for interpreting many of the frequent Indus signs and sequences, proving conclusively the Dravidian character of the language and the survival of the Indus elements in the twin streams of later Dravidian and Indo-Aryan traditions. There is substantial evidence that the Indus civilization was pre-Aryan. 1. The Indus civilization was mainly urban, while the early Vedic society was rural and pastoral. There were no cities in the Vedic period. 2. The Indus seals depict many animals but not the horse. The horse and the chariot with spoked wheels were the defining features of the Aryan-speaking societies. The bronze chariot found at Daimabad in western Deccan, the southernmost Indus settlement, has solid wheels and is drawn by a pair of humped bulls, not horses. 3. The tiger is often featured on Indus seals and sealings, but the animal is not mentioned in the Rigveda. Mahadevan goes on to enumerate the substantial archaeological and linguistic evidence that supports the Dravidian nature of the Harappan civilization. The evidence includes pictorial depictions on seals and sealings that suggest the worship of a buffalo horn male god, mother goddesses, the peepul tree, the serpent and, possibly, the phallic symbol, all of which have been derived not from the earliest Vedas, but from the pre-Aryan population. Many of these went on to become part of the Indian cultural tradition as we know it today, and this is a crucial point Mahadevan makes. The Indus heritage is shared by Dravidian as well as Indo-Aryan speakers. The Dravidian heritage is linguistic. The Indo-Aryan heritage is cultural, preserved through loanwords, words taken from another language, loan translations, phrases taken from another language, and myths. As I read it, the message of the Indus script is unity in diversity. In other words, after Indo-European language speakers reached South Asia, the language of the Harappans became limited to South India, while the culture and myths of the Harappans melded with those of the new Indo-Aryan language-speaking migrants to create a unique, syncretic tradition that is today seen as an essential part of Indian culture. Therefore, there is a disconnect between the earliest Vedas and the culture and practices of the Harappan civilization, but a connect between the later Vedic corpus and the Harappan civilization because these by then incorporate some of the ideas and themes of the Harappans. It is thus possible to see the heritage of Harappa in the language of the Dravidians, and in the myths, phrases and words borrowed by the Indo-Aryans from the Harappan tradition. See section titled, Harappans and the Vedas, Disconnect and Connect in Chapter 4 for details. Mahadevan identifies grammatical signs in the Harappan script that stand for the masculine singular suffix and also the non-masculine singular suffix. He identifies the arrow sign that frequently appears in the script as ampu, the Dravidian word that means arrow, but also stands for the non-masculine singular suffix in the earliest Kannada, Tamil and Telugu inscriptions, which means it appears at the end of female names. 6 Similarly, he identifies the frequently occurring ja sign in the Harappan script as the masculine singular suffix anu that is often appended at the end of male names. Mahadevan's most striking observation about the Harappan script is that many of its signs refer to the meticulously planned Harappan cities with their grid-like streets oriented towards the 4 cardinal directions and fortified citadels built on a high artificial terrace. For example, he identifies the square sign with a smaller square inside it as referring to an official title, the Lord of the House or Akatti in Dravidian, drawn from the root word akam, meaning inside the house, palace, fort, mind. The square itself, in this interpretation, would refer to the citadel or fort, and the small square inside it to its main resident. In Old Tamil, the word Akatan means the Lord of the Fort. Mahadevan suggests the name Agastya comes from Akatti and that the legend of Agastya in Old Tamil literature, where he is thought to have led 18 kings and 18 families of the Velir clan from North India to South India, could refer to the rulers of the Harappan civilization who migrated to the south after the civilization declined. By linking many signs in the script to Harappan cities themselves, he also shows how the Cheras, Cholas and Pandyas, 3 Tamil dynasties with a long history spanning centuries before and after the Common Era, may be identified by the roles they played within the Harappan urban civilization. He says, the Chola were counselors, surrounding and advising the ruler. The Chera or Cheral were high officials residing in exclusive quarters Keri with restricted entry. The Panti were the commoners who resided in the streets, Patti, of the lower city, Pali. These results corroborate the folklore that the Chera, Chola and Panti were brothers who lived together in one place in ancient times. This is a fascinating interpretation, but until more of the script is deciphered, we will not know for sure whether it is accurate, even though in Egyptian hieroglyphics there are very similar signs, with rectangles rather than squares, that carry similar meanings. House and fortified house. Also, the title of the ancient Egyptian rulers, Pharaoh, literally means great house. If Mahadevan used the Harappan city structure to decipher meanings in some of its inscriptions, Parpola turned to astronomy to find meanings in other parts. His argument is that astronomy was important and prevalent during the Harappan civilization, just as in the Mesopotamian civilization, especially considering the way the cities were built along cardinal directions. Both Mahadevan and Parpola begin with the assumption that the seals are likely to bear proper names of persons, with or without their official titles, just as they did in Mesopotamian seals. About 30 Harappan seals have been recovered from the Gulf and Mesopotamia, probably left there by seafaring Indian merchants, thus proving the importance the seal played as a way of guaranteeing the true provenance of merchandise. Both Mahadevan and Parpola also think the culture that followed the decline of the Harappan civilization, after the arrival of Indo-European language speakers, assimilated a number of Harappan concepts and cultural practices. Therefore, they use later traditions in Dravidian languages such as Tamil and Indo-European languages such as Sanskrit to substantiate their readings of the script. The most striking of Parpola's decipherments relates to the frequently appearing sign of the fish in the Harappan script. In Parpola's reading, the fish sign in the Harappan script refers to mian, the Dravidian word for both fish and star. Parpola argues that the frequency of the sign in the Harappan script, about 1 in 10 signs, is either fish or a modified fish, suggests that its most common reference is to star rather than fish. Therefore, a sign with 6 vertical strokes followed by a fish could mean aru, plus min with aru, meaning 6 in Dravidian, and min meaning star or fish. As it happens, there is indeed a constellation that is called Arum in the Pleiades. There are also Harappan inscriptions that show 7 vertical strokes followed by a fish, which would read as Elumin in Dravidian, meaning 7 stars, which refers to the constellation Ursa Major.
According to Parpala, both the Pleiades and Ursa Major play an
important role not only in early Indian mythology but also in the early history of Indian calendrical astronomy, which is probably of Harappan origin. The suggestion that the fish sign in the Harappan script could mean star predates Parpola, but he has built on the idea so extensively that he has made it impossible for anyone to ignore it.
The route to the south. If the dominant language of the Harappans was Proto-Dravidian, when did it reach South India from northwestern India?
The most common assumption is that this happened after the civilization declined and new migrant-speaking Indo-European languages or Aryans arrived in northwestern India sometime after 2000 BCE. This is the event that the Agastya or Akatti legend perhaps refers to. But Agastya and his Velir clans need not have been the first to bring Dravidian languages to South India, though they may have brought a more urbane form of it.
In fact, there is reason to think Dravidian languages may have reached South India perhaps as early as around 2800 BCE, even before the mature Harappan period began in 2600 BCE. This is around the time that we see the first evidence of pastoralism in South India, in northern Karnataka. Those who brought Dravidian languages to South India first may not have been the urbanites of the Harappan civilization but pastoralists, some of whom may remain so even today, like the Brahis of Balochistan. As we saw earlier, those who arrived in South Asia from the Zagros region were probably herders rather than full-fledged farmers, and while some of them settled down as farmers, perhaps after mixing with indigenous South Asians who were already experimenting with farming, others may have remained pastoralists. There is a possibility that some of these pastoralists may have brought cattle and goat herding to South India and they could have been the first to bring a Dravidian language here too. A look at the climatic map of India will show that there is a savanna zone, an expanse covered in grasses, that runs from Gujarat and Rajasthan through the central Deccan and all the way down to South India, along the western side of the peninsula. This would have been a perfect route for pastoralists to take as they expanded their range. In the 2006 paper Agricultural Origins and Frontiers in South Asia, a working synthesis, the archaeobotanist Dorian Q.
Fuller laid out the case for the introduction of domesticated animals, cattle, sheep and goats into peninsular India from the north. According to him, people in peninsular India had taken to cultivating 2 kinds of small millets and 2 kinds of pulses, a basic crop package like barley and wheat in northwestern India, sometime between 3000 BCE and 2300 BCE. They had domesticated these millets and pulses from locally available wild varieties. The earliest evidence
for the integration of this agricultural package with domesticated animals, mainly cattle, but also sheep and goat, comes from ash mounds, or large mounds of ash formed by the burning of cow dung, dated from around 2200 BCE. Fuller considers this ash mound tradition to be the outcome of interaction between cultivators and immigrant pastoralists, though he does not make any link between this possibility and language expansion. In other words, the introduction of pastoralism and domesticated animals to a region and a people who were experimenting with cultivation of millets and pulses is what could have led to the development of the full package of crops and domesticated animals. If this assessment is right, it is a possibility that migrant Dravidian language speakers could have been a crucial part of the agricultural story in southern India. The possible arrival of Harappan urbanites almost 1,000 years later would have built on an existing foundation of Dravidian language presence in South India. The distribution of Dravidian place names in Maharashtra, Gujarat and northwestern India could provide further evidence in support of the spread of Dravidian languages from northwest India to South India. Professor Franklin C. Southworth did an extensive study of Maharashtrian place names in Linguistic Archaeology of South Asia, and he wrote, "The primary evidence for the existence of Dravidian place names in Maharashtra consist of an estimated 800 or more village names with the suffixes vali or oli, probably derived from the Dravidian palli, a word meaning hamlet or village in Proto-Dravidian which occurs widely as a place name suffix in South India." The differences in distribution between the suffixes wali, oli and gab, from grammar, a word of Indo-European origin, suggest that different parts of Maharashtra were probably settled by Dravidian and Indo-Aryan speakers, with the Dravidian areas mainly in the Konkan coastal region and the southeastern part of the Deccan Plateau. Apart from the fact that the regions in which these suffixes are found are contiguous with areas to the south which show the Dravidian forms of the same suffixes, the probability of Dravidian influence is supported by other place name suffixes, as well as some initial place name elements, in those same parts of Maharashtra. Dravidian variations of Palli include Halli in the Kannada language, which often substitutes H for P.
Southward then goes on, place names with the suffix wali and variants also occur in Gujarat, Sindh, East and West Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh and Orissa, although not elsewhere in eastern India or Bangladesh, albeit with less frequency than in Maharashtra. Thus these regions may also have been home to speakers of Dravidian languages in the past, though it has not been possible here to investigate this wider region in the same detail as for Maharashtra.
The existence of Dravidian river names in northeastern Maharashtra suggests that all of Maharashtra might have been Dravidian speaking at an earlier time. Southward doesn't rule out the possibility that the widespread occurrence of Dravidian place names in coastal and southwestern Maharashtra, as well as in Gujarat and elsewhere, resulted from a later movement of Dravidian speakers from South India, but says, whatever may be the case, we are probably justified in concluding that by the early 1st millennium CE, extensive areas of Gujarat, coastal Maharashtra and southern Maharashtra were occupied by a population that used a Dravidian language for daily interaction, either as a primary home language and/or a lingua franca. Taking into account the archaeological, genetic and linguistic evidence for Proto-Dravidian being the lingua franca of the Harappan civilization, a parsimonious conclusion would be that the distribution of Dravidian place names all the way from northwestern India to South India indicates the movement of people from there to the south. Austroasiatic language speakers. So far, we have documented the arrival and expansion of two major groups that later intermixed and went on to create the Harappan civilization and provide the foundation for the Indian populations
with their origin in China after it had gone through an agricultural revolution. Rice and millets had been fully domesticated in the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys of China between 7500 BCE and 3500 BCE, and there is evidence for paddy fields by around 2500 BCE. There were two separate migrations of these farming populations, one through an inland route which accounts for the spread of Austroasiatic languages in Southeast Asia, and the other through an island hopping route, accounting for the spread of the Austronesian group of languages in maritime Southeast Asia,
including Malaysia, Indonesia and the Philippines, and the islands of the Pacific Ocean and Madagascar. India has no presence of Austronesian languages, so it is the first wave of migration through the land route, dated to around 2000 BCE, that is of direct relevance to our story. The study says these migrations that brought agriculture to Southeast Asia caused a dramatic change in ancestry there, with the original hunter-gatherers of the region, who are called Hoabinian and are related to the Onge of the Andamans, being displaced by Austroasiatic language-speaking agriculturists. The study had no access to ancient DNA of Austroasiatic language speakers from India, and so it makes no conclusions about their ancestry. However, since the study shows the connection between the Austroasiatic language-speaking farmers of Southeast Asia and the inland migration wave originating from China, the idea that Austroasiatic language speakers may have spread from India to Southeast Asia becomes untenable. The short explanation for the presence of Austroasiatic language speakers in India, therefore, is that they arrived from Southeast Asia around or after 2000 BCE, as part of the farming migrations originating from China. This suggests that around the time the Harappan civilization was beginning to crumble in northwestern India, there was an influx of people coming through eastern India. This is not surprising because an earlier study published in 2011, titled Population Genetic Structure in Indian Austroasiatic Speakers, had arrived at similar findings. This study was based on present-day genetic samples from 45 Indians and 15 Burmese covering 3 major language groups, Austroasiatic, Dravidian and Tibeto-Burman, and was co-authored by Gyaneshwar Chaubey, Tumas Kivisild and Matt Metzpalu, among others. Its conclusion was clear. We propose that Austroasiatic speakers in India today are derived from dispersal from Southeast Asia, followed by extensive sex-specific admixture with local Indian populations. The study found a significant Southeast Asian component, about 25%, among Indian Munda speakers. The strongest signal of Southeast Asian genetic ancestry among Indian Austroasiatic speakers, says the study, is seen in their Y chromosome, with approximately 2/3 falling into haplogroup O28. This haplogroup is older and has significantly higher diversity in Southeast Asia, strongly suggesting that it traveled from there to India rather than the other way around. The study also found that the Southeast Asian ancestry signal has been entirely lost in the mtDNA lineages of Munda speakers, which means that their maternal lineages are of Indian origin. This takes us to the second question: did the Austroasiatic language speakers bring rice farming to India? The short answer is no, and the long answer we will come to in a while. The study that answered the question conclusively was published in April 2018 and was titled, Genomic Variation in 3010 Accessions of Asian Cultivated Rice. This exhaustive research into the history of rice farming in Asia was led by the Crop Science Institute of the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and the International Institute of Rice Research, and the conclusion it came to was unequivocal: Asian rice, or Oryza sativa, which has 2 major subspecies called indica and japonica, had multiple independent domestications. This is how the study, which uses the name 11 for indica rice, puts it. Taken together, our results, combined with archaeological evidence of 11 cultivation for over 9,000 years in both India and China, support multiple independent domestications of Oryza sativa. As we saw in the previous chapter, there was evidence for harvesting of rice at Lahuradiva in the Sant Kabir Nagar district of Uttar Pradesh, dating back to 7000 BCE, and this study now provides additional evidence and puts the issue of origins of rice cultivation to rest. But there is a longer story too. The rice that was harvested in Lahuradiva and later domesticated in India is the indica subspecies of Oryza sativa, while the subspecies that was domesticated in the Yangtze Valley of China is japonica. The unlocking of the full potential of rice cultivation in India might have required hybridization of indica with japonica. According to Fuller, the protracted domestication process of rice in India was completed around 4,000 years ago, when hybridization with Chinese rice took place. Another study published in 2017, titled, Approaching Rice Domestication in South Asia, New Evidence from Indus Settlements in Northern India, also came to a similar conclusion. The data also suggests that when fully domesticated Oryza sativa SSP subspecies, japonica was introduced around 2000 BCE, it arrived in an area already familiar with rice cultivation and a range of cultivation techniques. So the emerging picture is of a productivity boost that occurs when japonica arrives in an area already familiar with rice agriculture and its hybridization with indica takes place. It is noteworthy that the period when this happened, around 2000 BCE, is the same as the period of arrival of Austroasiatic language speakers from Southeast Asia. Fuller, however, believes the introduction of japonica could have happened through the northwest region of India via trade rather than the northeast via migrations. Fuller's reason for not supporting the Eastern India migration route for the introduction of japonica into India is that there is no archaeological or archaeobotanical evidence for it. However, he himself says there could be a valid reason for such lack of evidence. Admittedly, Burma, Assam, Yunnan and Bengal are among the least well-known regions archaeobotanically and archaeologically. Archaeology is very geographically biased. Fuller's article was also written before there was ancient DNA evidence linking a migration from China around 2000 BCE to the spread of farming and Austroasiatic languages in Southeast Asia. Taking the DNA evidence into account, and the arrival of many East Asian crops and practices into India around 2000 BCE, A parsimonious explanation might be that starting around 2000 BCE there was increasing contact between the Indian and Chinese civilizations, through both trade and migrations and through both the eastern and northwestern regions. And this could have involved the migrations of not just Austroasiatic language speakers, but also Tibeto-Burman language speakers. Unlike in the case of Austroasiatic language speakers, there has never been a debate about the East Asian origins of Tibeto-Burman language, part of the larger Sino-Tibetan language family, speakers, who are today spread in small pockets in the Himalayan and sub-Himalayan regions and number about 5.5 million. This family includes the Meitei language of Manipur and Tani languages of Arunachal Pradesh. Here's a partial list of crops that Fuller says did come through the northeastern part of India, via Assam to the Indian plains: citrus trees, cultivated mango and the fiber crop rami, Bomyria nivea. The Mundas who preferred the hills to the plains, according to Fuller, are likely to have brought with them taro and a variety of rice called oz rather than japonica. Whichever way you look at it, by around 2000 BCE, some of the most important elements that make up India's population as it is today were in place. The descendants of the out-of-Africa migrants, the Zagros agriculturists, the Austroasiatic language speakers and the Tibeto-Burman language speakers. The wheels of history were turning, making a unique culture out of many different traditions, practices and belief systems. But there was one component yet missing: those who called themselves Aryans. To them we turn now. Note on the name. What is the correct name to call the earliest Indian civilization? Should one call it the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, the Indus-Saraswati civilization or the Saraswati civilization? In this book, we have followed the style of naming a civilization by the first city that was discovered. Harappa was the first city of the ancient Indian civilization to be discovered in the 1920s, and hence it came to be called the Harappan civilization early on. The term Indus Valley civilization is not correct because what it seeks to describe ranges far beyond the Indus Valley itself. The same objection applies to the name Saraswati Valley. The Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization may be a more accurate name than either Indus Valley or Saraswati Valley, but the naming of Ghaggar Hakrar as Saraswati is not without controversy and, in any case, the name does not cover all parts of the civilization. Tolivera and Lothal are neither in the Indus Valley nor in the Saraswati Valley. For these reasons, this book sticks to the name Harappan civilization.